Hello, critical thinkers, and welcome to this new episode of Healthy and Awake podcast. It's actually been quite some time since I've been able to bring you a new episode. If you follow my social media at all, especially LinkedIn, you know that I've had a few things going on, which has kind of just stalled my progress on the show. So I apologize to the regular listeners, but I recently moved from one city to another to be closer to family in South Carolina. So that's been going well. That took up more time than expected. And that was on top of the business rebrand that I was doing. So now my health coaching company is called Avantia Health Optimization. And we did that for a few reasons so we could reach more people and really just change things up a little bit because my previous approach I was very happy with. It worked very well, but I have more opportunity to help more people with my current brand. And all of the awake things that I used to talk about are not going away. So I don't even want to say used to talk about. I will still be talking about the awake topics in the health industry. And I'll talk a little bit more about Avantia ahead, but I want to explain what's going on in today's episode. I do have some interviews coming up to be released. I have interviews that I still have to conduct. So there are more episodes that are on the way. So I'm not going to be taking a break again for a while. But today, I'm going to do highlights of episodes of shows that I have been on. So not me as the host of Healthy and Awake podcast where I have a guest, but rather I've been the guest on other people's shows where they were the host. And I picked out 3 of the most recent episodes that I've been on where me and the host talked about some interesting topics. And so in order to really allow my audience to see some of the shows that I've been on and some of the other things that I talk about that I maybe don't usually cover on the show. But also, I'm grateful to the hosts of those shows. And so I encourage you to subscribe to the shows that I talk about today. So the first clip that I want to show you from an episode that I was on was with host Dr. David Gruder, who was also on an episode of my podcast. And his show is called Reimagining Humanity's Future and Yours. And you can find the full episode at rhfy.ca. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Gruder because he is very articulate in what he says. He's very smart, clearly. He's a PhD. And in this episode, we talk a lot about marketing and influence and propaganda. And those, as you probably know, are my favorite topics. And I took just a small chunk of the episode so you can really get a feel for what it's like. Of course, I'm going to put the links in the show notes for this episode and for the rest of them. So check out the full episode and be sure to subscribe. So without further ado, here's the first clip with Dr. David Gruder on reimagining humanity's future and yours.
Welcome back. Before the break, my guest, health innovator and coach Mike Vera, and I explored some of the key pieces of what's broken in our healthcare system. And in this segment, as I mentioned before the break, we'll unpack the root causes of this systemic breakdown, particularly lesser known ones that you and I might believe that the public really needs to be aware of. So, Mike, what are some of those lesser known causes?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with a disconnect between an understanding of ourself and our health and even our cognition, which leaves us vulnerable to undue influence. Because even though, we discussed the differences earlier between propaganda and marketing, let's face it, sometimes we might be marketed to buy something that we don't want. I see this all the time with exercise machines where marketing does a really good job at selling this idea of an exercise machine. And ultimately it ends up as a coat hanger. So I think the reason sometimes that can end up happening is because we don't understand truly the way those mechanisms work, which allow us to be influenced. And so that's a big part of it. How does our cognition really work? What are biases and heuristics and kind of what makes us tick behind the scenes? Critical thinking is very different from thinking, right? And I think part of the solution to not being as influenced as some of us might be is really understanding that difference. Thinking is kind of like thoughts appear in our head, and critical thinking is a deeper examination and an active effort. And in order to critically think effectively, I think it's essential to have a true understanding of that cognitive process.
Indeed. And before you go on, and I do want you to go on, I just want to make clear to our audience that might not be familiar with the term critical thinking, that what we're not talking about there is being critical and judgmental. We're talking about the capacity for discernment.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And if I may elaborate a little bit
Yeah.
further, and this is still kind of a component of what I was saying, is just an understanding of our health and what it really means to be healthy. And you look around in society, at least here in America, there's a lot of physical problems with health and a lot of mental problems with health. And when we don't have a true understanding of what it means to be healthy or what it means to be unhealthy and how we can end up in either of those situations, it can make things that aren't effective or productive or healthy seem like tempting options, even though they might not be. And so having a better understanding of what true health is and what we can do to help our health is a big way to really get at the root of the problem.
So part of what you're saying there is that until we really understand what true health is, not what symptom control is, but what true health is, we are inevitably going to remain susceptible to succumbing to shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. And in a world where we're constantly exposed to messages from every angle, from TV, phone, the social media, even our friends who might be more susceptible to these things than us, we're constantly exposed to these different ideas on a level that we really have never been exposed to before in history. And that's another part of the root of the problem.
Yes. And not just things that we've never been exposed to before, but that exposure is now instantaneous and worldwide because of the internet, which has never existed before recent years as well. So the manipulation of populations has gone on throughout history. And up until the modern age, that manipulation of people has occurred in more local areas rather than on an instantaneous global level. And so that of course changes the game hugely. I think there's another factor that I know you want to talk about in terms of hidden root causes that that's related to environmental factors, and I'd love for you to talk about that because, as you and I know, environmental factors are rarely talked about, even though they damage health.
Well, I think you just touched on that in a beautiful way. And that this goes perfectly into what I want to say here, which is nowadays with the internet, we have the capacity to be put into these digital crowds, essentially. So when you think of influence a long time ago, let's say the Roman Empire, we want to influence the population. They get people, they round them up into the Colosseum and they kind of hypnotize them with the spells there, right? With the games and all the shows that take place. They get them drunk and high on opium and all these different things, but you have to physically be in the same location. And now with the internet, that's kind of not the same case anymore. I think things have really changed where we can be in a group together and still be like in this digital space, but in our own home. And that really opens up this window for influence in our environment in a way that was never the case before. And so it is definitely something to seriously think about. And especially because that exact channel where we can be in groups digitally is also the same location where those messages are broadcast constantly. And even when our guard might be down, which is when we're most vulnerable.
Right. And I think you're referring to what in some circles is referred to as information bubbles that we're sectored into by internet algorithms that are used by search engines and social networks to feed to each of us whatever those algorithms think we believe or we're interested in. And so we all end up in different information bubbles if we're not aware of that phenomenon. And because our preconceptions are constantly reinforced inside those information bubbles, we end up thinking that what we see is what is true, when in fact, what we see is what is biased.
Yeah, and part of what I think helps facilitate that is what seems to me to be a push for the celebration of these collective identities and the relinquishment of the individual identity. And I think a lot of people find that tempting because it's comfortable to be in a group and have a team. And you see this with sports, you see this with politics, you see this even with music, how it's not, I'm a Taylor Swift fan, it's I'm a Swiftie, right? That's a class, like a group of people. And when you're in a group like that, hey, there's some value. I'm not saying groups are the worst thing in the world, but it does kind of remove that sense of individuality, and you kind of shift into this collective consciousness, group mentality sort of thing, by some people known as de-individuation. And to be honest, with the way that AI, artificial intelligence, is looking nowadays, I don't think moving forward that group identities will be as important, because AI can actually target individuals in a way that has just never been before possible in history.
Yes. I want to unpack that a little bit further. Before we do that, I want to wrap up a little bit more on environmental factors, because we've talked about a big one, which is the internet. I also think about, and I know you do too, other types of environmental factors, like the compromise of the quality of water, and the environmentally, and the and impacts of unfriendly electromagnetic electromagnetic fields that are unfriendly to the human electromagnetic field, and the compromising of air quality and things like that. So we've got environmental factors that are subtly, or not subtly, but covertly, in a sense, out of our awareness, influencing and deteriorating our health. So just quickly, what do you want to say about those environmental factors before we come back to what you were just talking about, de-individuation?
Sure. I think this might sound extreme to some people, but I like to refer to that as death by a thousand cuts, because you can take one component of one of these toxic sources of toxic exposure in our environment, or let's be frank, poisons in our environment. One of them might have minimal impact. So let's say the BPA in the water bottle, the microplastics, okay, there is some harms, but it's not going to, really be highly detrimental on its own, possibly. But then you start to look at it coupled with all the toxic chemicals in the air, and other things in the water, and the pesticides in the food, and the artificial light, the EMF that you mentioned. And we don't really know the impact of all of these things together. I mean, common sense would say that it's probably not good to have all of these poisons in various forms that we're exposed to regularly. And, that it really makes it tough for us to get our head above water, to even be able to catch our breath, to really kind of wrap our head around what's going on and what can we do about it.
Yes, exactly. And I want to underline your point just quickly before we go back to de-individuation, which is the notion that you said is spot on: death by a thousand cuts. Low level toxins from one source or in one way may or may not impact certain individuals. And even there, that's going to vary from one individual to another, depending on how robust or compromised their overall health is. But when you have the cumulative impact, the collective impact of multiple poisons, that's where almost everyone's system gets toxified, gets poisoned, gets compromised. And so I don't want to dwell on that because we're running out of time for this segment, but I want to underline that. Now back to de-individuation. Quick point, which is that the kinds of identities you were talking about a couple of moments ago are what I refer to as siloed identities, where we have an identity that's so over focused on a particular affinity that we have that we lose sight of our collective unified vision, or even a belief that there is a unified vision. And that's where we relinquish our individual identities to the point where we often polarize into groups that are only for personal freedom or groups that are only for collective well-being, when in fact, as long as we are social beings, our job is to integrate personal freedom and collective well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. And this sort of plays on, I know earlier we talked about cognition and heuristics and biases. We touched on that briefly, but this really gets at a fundamental component of the way our brain operates, and that's in-group, out-group bias. When we end up in one of these siloed categories, we are on a team. So we automatically make judgments about people who are on our team and for the better, and we automatically make judgments about the other team for the worse. And that's a shortcut that can, maybe a couple thousand years ago could save our life from the evil cavemen, and I have my cave tribe over here. But nowadays, I'm from Philly, and I wore a Cowboys jersey, not knowing any better, to a public school once. And I'm a kid in the 5th grade. I'm getting the middle finger just for wearing a jersey. I didn't do anything to these people, but they made an automatic judgment about me because I'm on a different team than them. And it's
Yeah,
really a shortcut that can be dangerous.
indeed. So after another short break, we'll get to the heart of the matter, where my guest, health resilience coach Mike Vera, will reveal alternatives to mainstream health systems that foster root cause healing and optimal health instead of symptom control. Stay tuned. We'll be back momentarily.
All right, so be sure to check the show notes for the rest of that episode. And next, we're going to go into a different episode with a different host. But I did want to first let you know a little bit more about Avantia, which I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. My health coaching business is Avantia Health Optimization. And as a health coach, what I do is I help people with their health goals in a way that is unique to you and what you want to accomplish, meaning that I'm not handing you some kind of cookie cutter program that, doesn't have much thought put into it and just here, follow this and leave me alone, basically. That is not the approach we take. I'm trained really in communication and behavior modification and a whole lot of other things, but it is very tailored to you. You can check out the testimonials on my website because we've already helped a lot of people. And that is either at mikevera.com, which is easier to type in than my other website, which is avantiahealthoptimization.com. Or, of course, you can search on Google for Avantia Health Optimization, where you will find that we have well over 100 5-star ratings on Google. And because a lot of people have not tried health coaching before, and they might not know exactly what it is or how it works, your first session is only $1. So if you go to the website, you submit your information, or you can give me a call. You can try it out for just $1. So you really have nothing to lose. And we'll figure out exactly how I can help you and what I can offer in order to help you. And I think you'll really be happy with what you hear. So one more time, try out your first health coaching session for just $1 by going to mikevera.com or avantiahealthoptimization.com or searching for us on Google, Avantia Health Optimization. So this next clip that I'm going to show is actually not a podcast clip. This is a talk that I gave virtually with a gentleman named Charles Frohman, who has a show that is especially prominent on Rumble. The channel is called Health Biz and Politics. We did this about a month ago, and I was really asked to talk about influence and my coaching approach. I broke this talk into 3 sections. 1, how to defend yourself from the undue influence of others. 2, how you can influence yourself. So if other people are influencing you, well, it would follow that you can use similar tactics to influence yourself. And then 3, how you can ethically influence others, because whether you realize it or not, your behavior is influencing other people. Anyone with kids knows that because they have to watch their mouth. They have to watch what they do because kids are like sponges where they pick up behaviors like that. And even if you don't intend to influence them, they are very well likely to be influenced by what you're doing. So I did about 20 to 30 minutes on those 3 sections. And then there was a Q&A at the end, which was very interesting because I love answering questions on the spot and hearing other people's thoughts about some of these ideas that I share. And some of the questions were more controversial than others. And I'm very comfortable in that territory. So it was really enjoyable. There's really a lot of value in this episode. So this clip in particular is on defending yourself from the influence. So it is the very beginning of the presentation, and I leave out the other parts. I leave out the Q&A. But if you do want to see the whole episode, you can find that on Rumble. Again, the channel is Health, Biz, and Politics. If you search my name on Rumble, you'll see a whole bunch of podcasts, and it's, I believe, on the first page there. So definitely check out the whole thing. I think you're really going to love this one. So without further ado, here is my episode with Charles Frohman. These are really some of the specific steps that you can take to defend yourself from influence efforts. And some of these might be more common sense than others, but all of these are really essential for having full control over your own mind to defend yourself. And number one is skepticism. There is such a thing as healthy skepticism. You don't want to be so skeptical that you end up, institutionalized with paranoid schizophrenia, right? That's the extreme end. But you also don't want to be so non-skeptical that you'll believe anything that's put in front of you. So find a healthy middle ground there. Be skeptical, meaning challenge authority, challenge the messages that are put in front of you. And an extension of that is the second point, critical thinking. So a weird thing is that a lot of people feel like they're thinking. So if they're watching TV, they're receiving those messages. It kind of feels like thinking. And that's why a lot of people did what they did during COVID, because it felt like they were thinking. But really, they were kind of just receiving that programming, receiving messages, and it was plugged into their head. Same thing with reading a book. Reading is not the same as thinking. You're inserting thoughts into your head by reading. So thinking, critical thinking, goes a step further and is contending with the ideas, is challenging, asking questions, using that skepticism we talked about in the previous point, critically thinking. And it's not easy. It's actually tough, which is why most people don't do it. And I say most people because you look at the pandemic, the way most people behaved, there is evidence there that most people did not engage in critical thinking. The next point is do your own research. So, don't just accept the first thing that appears in your feed, challenge it. And this is especially true if it seems tempting to believe. If you already believe something and this kind of goes in line with that, then especially you should research, because all of us, including myself, hold ideas in our head that are not true. And so research, and all these points have some overlap and they all go together. But research uses skepticism. It uses critical thinking, but it goes even further by looking for information that might even contradict ideas that you believe or sound good. And it's another extensive process. It's not easy to do. So let me actually pause here for a second and look at some of these messages. Yeah, people rarely read and even less actually think. I agree with that completely. That reminds me of the bike riders wearing masks. Yeah, people wearing masks outside. Like, where is the logic for that sort of thing? Really, there isn't one. That is not a scientific action to take. Charles said, we are taught to obey, not to think. 1,000%. The educational system, at least here in America, really, and especially with my own experience, it's taught to obey authority. I'm the teacher, you listen to me. You listen to the textbook and what the textbook says. And the moment you step outside of that, you possibly face some consequences. And then John said, Americans, for the most part, failed the COVID 1984 test. Yep, that is unfortunately true. But the good news is that people do seem to be waking up, thanks to very much like the people here in this group, it seems to me. So the last few points here, limit media consumption. Really most media is propaganda. I use that word kind of loosely. So propaganda meaning just messages put out to influence the way that you think. That could include marketing. That could include some individual putting ideas out there to influence the way that you think. So reducing your exposure, any of the unnecessary exposure, because anytime if you're just flipping through your phone mindlessly, you are unavoidably exposing yourself to propaganda. The last one, or second to last one there, is stay prepared. So physically and really mentally as well, stay prepared, stay strong, because propagandists rely on weakness. They prey on the vulnerable. So stay prepared as much as you can, anticipate things. I know one of your upcoming talks is on disease X. So that's another instance of being physically prepared. Having medicine, things like, if you believe this sort of thing, things like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. I've spoken with medical doctors who say that can be very helpful. And the last point here, learn about the human mind. So this is the equivalent of having a computer and understanding how it works so you don't get hacked. So your mind, unfortunately, can be hacked because of concepts like heuristics, biases, shortcuts in thinking, that if you don't know how these things work, you set yourself up for other people who do understand how these things work to target you accordingly. So marketers notoriously use advertising to exploit certain vulnerabilities. So they'll advertise catchy jingles to get stuck in your head. They'll blast the same ad over and over so that it's more available in your mind when it comes to making a decision. That's the availability heuristic. So learn about how the human mind works so that, again, you can defend yourself accordingly. All right, so that one was fun, and make sure to check out the show notes for the full episode that you can watch. The link will be in there. And now let's show the last clip for this episode, where I speak with Zach Colman, whose podcast and business is called Creative. And I spoke with Zach because he's a marketer who specializes in branding. And there's a few reasons that interests me, because on one hand, I'm a marketer for my own business. I need to use marketing so people know who I am and what I do and how I can help them. So these are tactics that I use. But also on the flip side of things, this is along my line of interest, influence. And as I've already discussed in this episode, there's a whole lot of layers to influence. Some people are more ethical than others. I, of course, I'm as ethical as could possibly be. That is part of what drives me to really bring awareness about these tactics so that people can really defend themselves from the unethical tactics, and that they can be ethical in their pursuit of influence, ethical and deliberate. And so this was a really interesting conversation. It gives you a neat glimpse into the marketing world and some of the lines of thinking behind marketing and branding, and why someone might trust one brand over another, and how you can sort of manufacture that perspective to get people to trust you, and how you can analyze whether or not that trust is warranted. Should you even trust this company? And it's really enjoyable because Zach really knows what he's talking about. Again, he does marketing for a living. So you can find this on YouTube and all the podcast platforms, just like the rest of these, by either just searching Zach Colman, Mike Vera, Creative, or you can check the show notes for the link. But let's get into this last clip. And at the end of it, I'll see you again, where I'll wind us down and give some closing points. So I'm sure maybe you're aware, like when you're trying to target people in marketing, one thing we often take into consideration is, what is their current level of awareness? So are they not even problem aware? Like, do they not have the awareness that they even have this problem in the first place? Are they problem aware, but they're not solution aware? So that's a whole separate mode of approach in talking to these types of people. Okay, so are they problem aware and solution solution aware? So do they know the problem they have, and are they currently like looking for other solution? And so there are all these different stages where somebody could be at. And if you're talking to somebody who is not problem aware or solution aware, they don't even know that they have this problem that you have the solution to, it's going to be a lot harder to gain their trust, possibly. If you have to like not only sell them on your solution, but you have to point out that they have this problem in the first place. And so that could take a lot more work. Now, on the other side of things, on the other side of that spectrum, you have somebody who is problem aware, they're solution aware. Maybe they've even been doing some research to figure out like, hey, I have this problem. Who can help me out? Who's there? So now they have some idea of what this environment is like. Maybe they're a little more open to being trusting. Like, hey, we're both, you and I are aware of this problem. Let's talk about it. I think in that instance, it can be easier to build trust.
Yeah, there was a lot there to unpack because I 100% agree with you on that. I think it's quite interesting that you brought that up. And you bring up a point when it comes to that controversial versus professional. I think going off of your last statement and what you were talking about with building that trust, a lot of people are, and back to what we said about trust, either you start with it or you have to be a little bit more skeptical. People are probably a little bit more fearful on, oh, well, do I come off professional? Do I come off controversial? How do you really strike that balance? How do you really strike that balance and being able to still have that edge of, hey, I'm trying to run something here. I'm trying to bring value or I'm trying to do something, but you still have to be professional about it.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's really tough. And balance, I think that word should be emphasized in this context because for me in particular, I am balancing as if I'm walking on a tightrope because I do want to be professional, but I also love being controversial. I mean, it's part of my personality that I pour into my business. And for an example, this morning on LinkedIn or Facebook, I posted a quote by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And the quote is, "If the truth shall kill them, let them die." Now, that's a very harsh quote, basically saying like, if you can't even handle the truth, if that's going to kill you, then you basically deserve to die. And a lot of companies out there like that, for them, that would be very unprofessional and they would never post something like that. But for me, one of my top values is truth. I really mean that. Like, I'm not posting that to be controversial. I'm posting it because I mean it. And I also happen to understand that it's controversial. So there's a difference. I don't want to be controversial for the sake of pissing people off or trying to make enemies. I don't want to make enemies. I don't want to upset people.
That's funny enough why half the time I don't write anything on Facebook because it's like, I can see both sides here. And no matter what I say, someone's going to yell at me.
Yeah.
So, but back to your point, my best friend that I've had since I was 15 years old, about 23 years now, me and him have a lot of different opinions on things. He will rant, and funny enough, has very similar opinions to my mom, which I think is kind of funny, but he'll rant about all this stuff, him and his wife, but my wife and his wife talk all the time. I still hang out with him constantly. And I'm like, oh, silly friend, like, beliefs. I encourage him to live by his beliefs. That's his beliefs. And I'm like, I'm willing to hear him, and that comes, I think, down to business too. And that's part of branding. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand. You are a brand, even if you're a doctor, if you're pharmaceuticals, no matter what you're doing, you have that ability to have people hear your voice and your tones. And you have smartly been able to yourself dictate, hey, these are my values. This is my brand. And it shows how good you are able to make certain decisions on your brand voice and what you're going to say, because you're like, hey, this is my voice. This is what I have to say. And back to your point on that controversial side, I think that I always say in my industry and what we do with the branding and the stuff, there are people that aren't awake yet. Like you would probably say they're just not awake yet. But for me, I was like, people don't see value because they don't necessarily understand or perceive the need for that value yet. So how are they going to see value if they don't understand the value yet?
And that's why I think compassion is important. And I maybe should have emphasized this with my previous answer a little more, because I could definitely come across as a jerk if just saying the things that I'm saying, like if the truth shall kill them, let them die. But I think what makes it less of a jerky sort of thing to say is that I genuinely come from a place of compassion, that I'm not putting it out there to be mean. I think good brands should have an element of compassion because, maybe not overtly, it doesn't have to necessarily be listed, but I think brands should behave with compassion, right? Because otherwise the I mean, the opposite is discompassion, which is like, I don't care about you. I don't really care what happens to you. I'm in it to get mine. I want to make my money, and I don't really value you as a human being. So I'm just here to get that money. On the flip side of things, with a compassionate perspective, which is what we hold at Healthy and Awake, is, I do care about people. Like, everything that I do is because I care about people. Like, I put all my time and effort, and I'm obsessed with this project because I genuinely want to make the world a healthier, more awake place. I mean, you have to have compassion to have that sort of mission. All right. So those are all the clips for today's podcast. Just highlights today, but I have some interviews coming up. So expect more content, more episodes, more everything soon. Definitely stay tuned for all of that. Be sure to check out the show notes. Be sure to go to mikevera.com so you can try your first health coaching session for just $1. So you can see what it's like to work with me and what we can do to help you with your health and all your goals and everything in between. And other than that, stay